Hi, I'm James Gardner, host of Your History, Your Story, a podcast for anyone who loves hearing fascinating tales about remarkable people, intriguing topics, and significant historical events. Our hope is to inspire you to uncover and share your history and your story. Today on Your History, Your Story, we're joined by Samuel Marquis, acclaimed author of numerous American history and suspense books, including Blackbeard, The Birth of America. Samuel is here to talk about his latest work, Captain Kidd, a true story of treasure and betrayal. While many people remember William Kidd as one of history's most notorious pirates, he was in fact a respected privateer, merchant, and wartime hero who made his home in colonial New York City in the late 1600s. Samuel, who happens to be Kidd's 9 times great-grandson, shares the real story of a man far more complex than legend suggests, and who ultimately became a scapegoat for powerful political forces. So I'd now like to welcome Samuel Marquis to our show. Welcome, Samuel.
Great to be here. Thank you, James.
Samuel, when I was in 6th grade, I think, my mother said during the summer, you cannot go the whole summer without reading a book. You have to read a book. So she picked one out for me, and it was Treasure Island. And at first I was like, oh, I don't want to read this. Well, I loved it. I got entrenched in it. And from that point on, I was really very interested in that pirate era and all the swashbuckling and all those things. And I thought to myself, I'd love to know about these pirates. So you get this preconceived notion of who these guys were, with the patch on the eye and the parrot on the shoulder and the wooden leg and all that stuff. And so, a lot of years have passed since 6th grade. And when I found out that we had the opportunity to interview you about your book, Captain Kidd, a true story of treasure and betrayal, fantastic book. This book really dispels a lot of preconceived notions I had about William Kidd, also known as Captain Kidd.
Well, it's good to be here and dispel some myths, but also just sort of tell the true story of the man behind the myth.
Yes, and you are the 9th great-grandson of this gentleman. When did you find out that you were related to him?
I grew up with stories. I was talking about it with another first cousin of Captain Kidd. I mean, first cousin of mine, but 9th great-grandson of Captain Kidd. And we were trying to figure out exactly when, but it was clearly, I wrote a paper about him in high school. And I got the ultimate slackers B- because I crammed it in like 2 days. But I think, by the time I was 6 to 10 in that era, I was told, oh, you're the 9th great-grandson of Captain Kidd. And of course, he was the villainous cutthroat, but kind of a swashbuckler Errol Flynn, too. So our family, didn't smooth it over. I mean, they still wanted him to be this villainous, kind of Blackbeard type figure. But yet we were also like, well, he was a wealthy New Yorker and an upstanding guy too, but it never really reconciled the two until I wrote this book, on Captain Kidd. So I was a little bit rogue, but also kind of swashbuckling Errol Flynn, and the stories were complete balderdash. But when you're a little kid, you're like, I thought it was pretty much Treasure Island, and I had no idea how important he was to creating the Treasure Island mythology of buried treasure. It's almost all single-handedly Captain Kidd, my 9th great-grandfather.
Yeah, of course, the buried treasure part is like the really cool part because that could extend up till today, that it's out there somewhere to find or things like. I remember going out not too many years ago. I went out by Montauk Lighthouse, and I remember standing out there, and it was a storm sort of brewing, and I was looking at the water, and I thought to myself, wasn't Captain Kidd like lurking around here somewhere burying treasure? And it's just, even to this day, I'm in my 60s now, and thinking back of just the intrigue and the excitement of sort of a pirate life and buried treasure as well.
Yeah, and he's like I said, there were some other pirates who buried treasure short term, only short term, because most of the time they came back and went straight to the taverns and the prostitutes and just went crazy for 2 or 3 weeks. And then they'd be like, "Oh, my money's run out. I need to go. I need to get to sea again." So they didn't bury treasure. Captain Kidd only did it as a precautionary measure because he didn't trust Lord Belmont, who was his sponsor in his Indian Ocean expedition. So he didn't do it to go become a pirate hiding away his treasure for a rainy day. He did it because he didn't trust the royal governor of New York, Massachusetts Bay, and New Hampshire, who was Lord Belmont, who's kind of the villain of my book, to be honest.
Yeah, we'll find out a little more. I want to ask you more about him in a second, but I want to talk about you for a minute now. So I read that you're a hydrogeologist. That's what you do as your vocation. So you're a scientist, but you're also the writer of many books that are, you've got historical fiction, you've got nonfiction books like this one. You wrote a book on Blackbeard. You've got this other side of you. How do you balance these two passions of yours?
Well, it's not easy, but I find a way just because it's kind of I'm sort of driven and so I have my day job as I'm a principal hydrogeologist and vice president with an environmental firm out in, a national environmental firm, and I work in Colorado, but I also write books on the weekends and at night and any chance I get, and I still have to be a father and a husband, so I got to juggle all this stuff, and I just trying to make it work by just doing as much as I can in a day, and being efficient. So, I still have my day job because I love being a hydrogeologist. So I'm involved in groundwater cleanup and groundwater modeling, and I do expert witness work, to try and clean up the environment. So I do that, and then I'm also just been an avid history buff my whole life. So it comes naturally to me. I started out writing environmental thrillers because I'm a hydrogeologist. And so I sort of have my Joe High Eagle series, who's basically a Native American lacrosse playing hydrogeologist, so because we have a connection to the Northern Cheyenne with my Thomas B. Marquis, one of my relatives. And so and I played lacrosse till I was 60. So you can see my daughter played at Swarthmore here. I'm wearing the hat. So we're kind of a lacrosse family too. It's sort of our kind of thing that we got going too. So I guess I'm, yeah, a little bit of I don't know what you call it, a factotum, a renaissance guy. I don't know. So juggle a lot of things, but hopefully I make it work.
May I ask you what kind of vitamins you take?
Yeah, yeah. No, I just like to be active. I miss playing lacrosse. Believe it or not, I played till I was 60 with the young guys too, but I play attack. So you're always on offense. So you just got to off ball cut and, get it and make one quick move rather than run the field. So when you get older, as we have to be clever with our little tactics I don't ski this, I still ski hard, double blacks and stuff, but I always go to the soft snow off to the right or left, not down the ruddy bumps in the middle.
I'm focusing on being able to walk down my front steps without falling. But Samuel, let me ask you this. Reading your book, it's just filled with incredible detail. I feel like I'm on these ships out on the high seas in adventure. There must have been an incredible amount of research involved, but when did you decide that you wanted to actually write about Captain Kidd, and why did you choose to write it after you wrote the book on Blackbeard, considering you're not descended from Blackbeard?
Yeah, it's a funny story because I grew up with this sort of pirate mythology a little bit, but of Captain Kidd. My grandfather had a place on St. Croix, and we used to go like every second or third year. And I didn't realize that Blackbeard was at St. Croix, Captain Kidd was at St. Croix, Alexander Hamilton got his start on St. Croix in Christiansted. So I have a picture of me and my father when I'm a little kid, and he had just bought me this little soldier. And so I didn't realize that how much that would resonate in this whole pirate thing that was always deep inside me from the Captain Kidd mythology that I grew up with and family stories. And then this sort of my grandfather's little place in St. Croix that we used to go like every second year or every third year, but enough that I remember it significantly. Had a huge impact on me. And so then at some point, I was in Ocracoke Island and and I picked up this book on Blackbeard by Kevin Doofus, who wrote a great little thing on Blackbeard, had good color, and I was like, man, this is interesting, And I was just glued to the book. And then we started going to Wrightsville Beach after that, and Ocracoke, and we kind of like that little area for as Colorado people, we like the ocean to get away. So we kind of discovered this Wrightsville Beach has Caribbean type water, and then further south of Ocracoke. So my wife, one time I'm looking out where Blackbeard fought his last battle and died, and I was like, God, it's 17, it's 2018, it's the 300th anniversary of Blackbeard's death, and my wife's like, you better write that book, get busy. So I'm like, okay, God, I gotta go. So I moved pretty fast, to get it out because I was into it already. I was reading a lot of pirate books, Marcus Rediker, kind of the basics, David Cordingley, all the books you start with that are general pirate things, Angus Constam, and so I wrote that book, Blackbeard, because my wife's prompting. And then I started down the road, I started to do Captain Kidd as historical fiction, but my books are very heavily factual historical fiction. So this transition to narrative nonfiction, but with 100 pages of endnotes and bibliography, came when I was halfway through the book. I just said, what am I doing? I got to write the definitive Captain Kidd biography. I'm his ninth great grandson. I can write as good a book as, these guys out there. But I was concerned because Robert Ritchie wrote the top book at that point, and then Richard Zach. So I was like, well, I got to be as good as those guys. I have to be one of the top 3 kid books ever if I'm going to do this. So I just, knuckled down and I realized I should have been doing historical nonfiction all along because I'm a scientist, and it was like footnoting, endnoting, all this stuff. Came naturally to me. I just had no idea. So I want to write as many of these as I can in the next, whatever, 15 years because this is what I'm good at.
You're very good at it. And reading the book, I'm almost feeling as I'm reading it that you were writing it with a passion to honor your ancestor, but also be very truthful about him. You're very tempered in how you're not just saying, "Oh, he's just this great guy, totally misunderstood." You always temper it with different things that some of the mistakes he made, and he was a real human being. So I could feel your family connection in your writing while also being a very objective historian while you're writing it.
Yeah, and I really wanted to be fair but sympathetic, and I think that's how it comes across. I don't say he wasn't. Well, he wasn't a pirate. I'm going to say that. But was he guilty technically of piracy because he didn't manage his crew better? That's up for debate. And is he guilty of, without giving the book away, is he guilty? He's most certainly not guilty of murder, but is he guilty of manslaughter? So I leave it open because I think it is open. But to make him out this villainous cutthroat who, was just the destroyer of the English trade and a villain like the English crown made him out to be is just complete BS.
Most
And
of
I had to prove that. I had to go forcefully demonstrate that in my book.
Right. And what I was wondering about Kidd was he a person that when you were digging into him, did your idea who he was change dramatically during your research, or did you kind of have a good idea that this was how it was going to roll out by what you'd already read?
Well, the thing about Captain Kidd is he's and I say it at the end of my book, and I think you probably remember, there's people in history that for whatever reason, people are either kind of on one far, I won't say far left, far right in the political context, but are just 180 degrees apart on who this person was. Alexander Hamilton has really been kind of miscast as this sort of, the people of the rich, the snooty, guy, when he had a lot of qualities that were, I think, better than Jefferson. Whereas Jefferson's come out as, even though he's the slaver, he's come out as, oh, the man of the people and all this. So, and I know you hosted an event on Benedict Arnold. Here's talk about the greatest general of the Revolution, who won Saratoga. Gates didn't. And then now he's just, oh, no one knows anything about that. They just know the villain. Captain Kidd was like the super good, the trusty and well beloved Captain Kidd of England. And then he's become the most notorious scoundrel, one of the most notorious scoundrels of all time. And so, I had to present the truth as I see it, which is that he was basically a good guy that got in an impossible situation, but had flaws, and I admit those. And I actually had a lot more of that in my original book, which was a lot longer. So I had a lot more of but when you cut back, you have to keep sort of the key elements of them. So my original thing was probably even a little harder on them, but you got to cut back these books. They don't allow 150,000 word books anymore. That's not happening. Yeah.
No, but you definitely keep the original book that you wrote on hand somewhere for future historians, maybe even in your own family to use as a reference for more writing and more research into them. But while let's talk about Captain Kidd. Let's talk about him. I know that his early history is really hard to kind of nail down, but where do we find Kidd in his earliest part of life that's evident to you as a researcher?
Well, we really don't have a lot of record on Captain Kidd's early years at all. We just have sort of, the some of the genealogical and DNA evidence that's come out from Dr. David Boyles from the University of South Dakota School of Mines and Technology, who's an expert on the sort of genealogy behind Captain Kidd. And so he was born in England, but he went to Scotland at an early age and kind of became sort of Dundee, probably a cabin boy or at least an apprentice of some kind at an early age is the thinking is where most people come around. And so I kind of, quickly lay out that because there's not a lot of detail to it. At some point he got into the as a Caribbean buccaneer, and the buccaneers were not pirates. There were licensed privateers who were roguish, there's no question, but they were, very selective in attacking Imperial Spain and to some extent Portugal. So they were started out as the French boucaniers on the island of Tortuga and Hispaniola, and then eventually they went to Jamaica around, Cromwell's time in 1654, and the English took Jamaica from the Spanish. At that point, it became sort of the Buccaneer stronghold where they attacked Spain, brought the treasure back to Port Royal, which was the wickedest city on earth at the time. And so so the Buccaneers is not another word for pirate, as I say in my book. They were roguish and very pirate-like, but they were very selective in only attacking Spain, and they did have licenses. Now, some of them were flimsy licenses, but there's a difference between them and a true pirate in Blackbeard's era from roughly 1715 to 1718. He only had a 3-year run, Blackbeard. He, basically had no license. He's out attacking the ships of all nations eventually. He started out with all non-English ships, but then at some point he just said, well, I'm going to attack everything. So really kind of a true pirate in the sense would be a villain of all nations attacking the ships of all countries indiscriminately.
That's very helpful. That's very helpful. So a buccaneer and a privateer are essentially the same thing.
Yeah, except for the Buccaneers have this glamorous reputation for roguery and, because they were wild. I mean, they were, to be honest, the difference between Royal Navy men, and I say this in my book too, Royal Navy men, privateers, pirates, they called them wreckers who were salvage. The treasure ships everywhere because of storms. So there were salvage crews all over the Caribbean, always trying to find treasure. So those guys are full time. And there were woodcutters, the log cutters from the Bay of Campeche and other. So all of these guys are just mariners of the era. Some were a little more roguish than others, but there's no difference. The Royal Navy guys committed piracy all the time, but they had a license to do it. So, it's a modern convention. Historians are smart. Mark Hanna Douglas Burgess and Guy Chet and all these, the modern top pirate historians today, working today, know that there was not a lot of difference between all of those types of mariners back in the 1600s and 1700s.
It sounds both exciting and terrifying to have been a mariner back in the 17th and early 18th century, for sure, wouldn't it be?
Yeah, I mean, it's a constant. I mean, between the storms, the terrible food that always got rotten, it was always moldy. And the hardtack. I mean, come on, you'd have to soften it up with, water. I mean, they were just your teeth, you'd lose a tooth eating them,
Oh, yeah.
eating hardtack, that they had to eat. And the peas, they had a lot of peas back then. So you had barrels of peas and then, rarely fresh fruit and vegetables. Although Captain Kidd did a pretty good job of preventing scurvy for his crew. So scurvy was a constant problem then. No one understood it. They all thought it was not enough good air, that you were unchristian. I mean, it was complete ridiculous, reasons for that scurvy would be caused. And they would lose 10, 20, 30% of your crew, on these voyages to scurvy.
Yeah, I seem to remember that the English were called limeys because they discovered it really in effect that I guess the vitamin C effect prevented scurvy.
Yeah. So by the American Revolution, the Royal Navy ships were carrying lime juice regularly and maybe trying to get fruits more often. So I think it was by the Revolution, it was better understood. It wasn't perfectly understood until probably the War of 1812. By then, I think people understood scurvy and had ways to prevent it.
Right. So let's talk about Captain Kidd as a war hero. That's sort of where you sort of really get into the book about him. Could you tell us how he was a war hero?
Yeah, so Captain Kidd basically fought in King William's War, fought from 1689 through 1697. And so he originally was in the Caribbean as a privateer on a French ship and the St. Rose. And then he and the 8 Englishmen aboard took the ship in 1689 from the French, took it, and then sailed to Nevis Island, and just a short distance, a day's sail away, in the middle of because England had declared war on France, and so they switched sides because they were. Remember, he was a privateer, so sometimes he would sail under French or Dutch colors but not against England. So Kidd would never go against England under any circumstances. He loved England, and he was a colonial American, but very connected to the English. And so they took this ship, and then he fought for Colonel Codrington, who was the governor general of the English Leeward Islands. And so he fought for him for like a year and a half in the Caribbean, and became a hero in the Caribbean. And then he returned to New York. He had already planted roots in New York in 1688. So he returned to New York, and right away he's called in to save the day there, So he became a hero overnight, and he got earned over like $100,000, for kind of ending the rebellion that was going on for the Glorious Revolution, Leisler's Rebellion. He sort of, sided with the crown in that, with the new royal governor coming in, and became a war hero. And immediately, he already had money because he didn't just spend all his money on liquor like all the other, freebooter, wild plunderers, and even privateers were wild guys. And so he saved his money and bought some prime real estate. And then he married Sarah Bradley, one of the most beautiful English woman in New York. I mean, everything was going well for Captain Kidd. And so he was a war hero in King William's War, from 1689 to 1697. And that's how he became the trusty and well-beloved Captain Kidd of King William III when he went to London later.
Okay, now you mentioned Sarah, who you talk about, and that other side of Captain Kidd, a family man, husband, loved his wife. Can you give us a little hint as to how they met and how much she meant to him and vice versa?
Yeah, I wish we knew more about it, to be honest with you. But he moved to New York in 1688. He met her then. And then there is DNA evidence of them, of Captain Kidd and Sarah, having a child together. And so by 1688 they knew each other. When their affair began, it definitely began by 1689 when Kidd was in port, and then he might have returned again later. But in any case, when Kidd returned in 1691 for good, in March of 1691, they reconnected almost immediately. At that time, though, she was married to John Urt, a Dutchman who was sort of a struggling Dutchman, because her first husband, William Cox, who was a prominent Dutchman who was, a prominent merchant, but twice as old as Sarah. So that was an arranged marriage by Sarah's father, Captain Samuel Bradley, and Sarah. So Cox died in August of 1689. Sarah waited a whole year to get remarried, but she did remarry because she was desperate to get her money because it was tied up by Jacob Leisler. He was sort of the usurping governor of New York because the new crown appointee, Richard Slaughter, hadn't arrived yet. So it's kind of complicated to get into all this, but to make a long story short, Kidd and Sarah had a relationship by 1688. We're at least friends, and by 1689, we're definitely lovers. But Kidd was out fighting, and he was in the Caribbean, and he got kind of taken away on a ship for longer than he expected. And then his crew mutinied and stole his ship from him and stole all his money because he wouldn't turn pirate. And so that delayed his return to New York by a significant amount. And so by 1691, though, by May of 1691, they're married within 2 days of John Ort's death. So under suspicious circumstances. So, he died on May 14th, and she's married to Kidd 2 days later. And Leisler's hung on the same day that they're married. So if there's I say they could have. I don't think Captain Kidd bumped off Urt, but I do raise the question because could have maybe they're arguing over Sarah and they got in a fight, but then Sarah had to cover it up, and she's very Christian. I mean, I know that they had a premarital dalliance, but New York was the most liberal town and colony in North America throughout its history. So because it was the most multi-ethnic, and so it was a lot different than Puritan Boston or Quaker Philadelphia. So them having an affair is not that. And also, her husband was twice her age. So, and she had a separate place right near Kidd's property. And her husband was William Cox at that point was up island near, where modern day northern Central Park would be. So there's a lot of little stuff there that we wish we knew more. The point is Sarah and him had a deep relationship. I mean, let's face it, you read the book, so you know how much she did for him, and you know what he was saying when he's, about to die. Who's he thinking of? Sarah and his daughters. That was a strong love relationship.
Absolutely, it was. And from what I read in your book, for sure, the thing is that Kidd at this point in time sort of becomes acclimated to being a New York merchant. So he was a merchant mariner. So he sort of settles down, I guess, in quotes. What was that period like?
Well, that period, we don't have a lot of material, for one thing. We know that he was the lead juror, jury foreman on a trial in 1694. He sold one of his properties. He was a man about town, hobnobbing with all the wealthiest New Yorkers. Frederick Phillippe's family, the Schuyler family, the Livingston family, Van Cortlandt family. These are all the Grahams, the Emmotts. These are the most prominent families of New York, and probably still today. So Captain Kidd was an English, and it helped that he was an Englishman, because remember the Dutch, there was friction between the Dutch then, and English were kind of rising above in some ways. And Sarah was English too. So they would have been really kind of the most prominent young English couple in New York. And by then his wealth was combined with Sarah's, because she did have a lot of wealth from her first husband, William Cox. But Kidd had his money on his own. And then he became a merchant seaman, sailing to Antigua and the Dutch and the English West Indies. He sailed to both because he established contacts definitely on the Dutch islands too, that later came to help him. So he became very popular, had a lot of friends from mariners, from common mariners to the richest people. And he really was sort of socially, and Sarah too was, remember, she was a socialite and she was probably well known about town and stuff. So you have to kind of fill in a little bit of that period. And I kind of go through it pretty quickly just because of the page count limitations, but he became a prominent citizen, was very happy, had two daughters. He had Elizabeth and little Sarah, so he had two daughters then, and was kind of a man of affairs about New York. He was kind of a leading New Yorker at that time.
Yeah, I think even though there's not a lot of information, I think it was important to know that he was sort of in good shape. It was, two children, a wife that he loved. He was well respected. But this is a point at which you almost want to say it's like a middle-age crisis he goes through. And he decides to sort of leave this, at least in his mind temporarily or whatever, to seek more adventure. Could you tell us about that?
Well, I think that what was going on by 1694, Thomas Tew, Tew, was a Rhode Island gentleman, sea captain, privateer who went and raided in the Indian Ocean. And this is when the Red Sea Man era began. And ships from Newport and New York City, and maybe a little bit lesser extent Boston, sailed to the Indian Ocean, to the mouth of the Red Sea, and took these treasure ships that were worth 20 million today to 200 million dollars. I mean, these are making little farm boys from Maryland millionaires overnight, and seamen, and licensed seamen. So Captain Kidd, all this is going on. The money's pouring into New York. It's pouring into Newport. There were no banks then. This is the biggest money. This is the biggest gold rush, the first gold rush in American history. Captain Kidd is seeing all this around him, and everyone's talking about it. All these fancy furnishings from the East, exotic furnishings, are coming into the homes of the governor and everyone else, and Kidd's at this parties because he's a top social. Him and his wife is on the social circle, and they see all this money pouring in. He's a seaman doing merchant runs to the Caribbean, so he's hearing all about these treasure ships. So at some point in 1695, the spring of 1695, he decides that he wants to get a crown. He doesn't care so much about going and making money in the Red Sea. He just wants one last shot at kind of a naval command as a crown privateer. So he's a merchant seaman though, so he takes a load of linens and other New York items to London with his brother-in-law, Samuel Bradley, Sarah's brother. And there he wants to get a crown license to be a privateer, kind of a notch up from what he's done. Well, he gets embroiled in, he gets reeled in by the king and his leading ministers, Lord Belmont and a number of others, Admiral Russell and the Duke of Shrewsbury, who are the most powerful men in England, to go hunt down pirates in the Indian Ocean. Hunt down the Red Sea men because it's all growing. And England is like, oh my God, how do we stop these guys? Well, they decide that Captain Kidd's going to go do it for them. And though, Kidd will be rewarded, but so what does Kidd do? He tries to get out of it. He's like, I'm not going to hunt pirates in the Indian Ocean. I want a privateering license to fight the French. I want to be a crown privateer fighting the French. That's what I do. He couldn't get out of it. Lord Belmont threatened him, his sponsor, and the soon-to-be governor of New York, Massachusetts Bay, and New Hampshire, and threatens to take his ship, threatens to take all of his men, and threatens to, basically, and also threatens to destroy him when he comes over as royal governor in New York. He even says, well, when I come over there, I'm going to be a thorn on your side unless you do this. By then, they had lined everything up, and Kidd kind of was uneasy about it, and probably at first it sounded okay, and then at some point he got cold feet, and he tried to get out of it. And it's clearly in the record that he tried to get out of it. Well, he didn't get out of it. And he finally said, well, I'll make it work, So then he sails back to New York and refits and reunites with Sarah because he wanted to see her. and then sets out for the Indian Ocean and, the fateful voyage of Captain Kidd in
Ah.
1696. So he sets out, sails from New York in September 6th of 1696.
And then things really, circumstances outside of his control sort of go awry. There's a man by the name of Henry Avery, and kind of what that man did sort of set things on a wrong path toward Captain Kidd, didn't it?
Yes. So Thomas Tew was first. So Thomas Tew went in 1693. He came back in 1694 with, over like 100, I think it's at least $120 million of treasure. And his crew wasn't that big. So and they came into Newport and they were received like kings, like princes. Like, oh my God, hey, they stuck it to the infidels of the East. No one cared. No one cared about robbing East India. They were Muslim heathens. No one cared. And Muslim heathens thought just as negatively of Christians. It went both ways. And so they came back and were celebrated as heroes. Thomas Tew got a new license from Benjamin Fletcher, the governor of New York, because he couldn't. The Newport guy was getting cold feet. The Newport governor wouldn't give him one, so he went to New York, and Benjamin Fletcher was giving out licenses pretty regularly then because they didn't see it as a criminal activity. They saw it as bringing money into because of the navigation acts that were restrictive by England. Piracy and smuggling were well accepted in colonial communities. Well, Thomas Tew united with Henry Avery on his second voyage to the Indian Ocean in 1695. So in the fall of 1695, they raided, these treasure ships, and then Henry Avery, and the crew pillaged and raped, and that, the Great Mughal of India was infuriated and wanted to shut down trade with the East India Company. And so Thomas Tew and Henry Avery, and then a few others, created this pirate craze, the Red Sea Men craze in the Indian Ocean. And Kidd followed right behind them. And he was actually tasked with hunting down Thomas Tew on his license. On his privateering commission, Tew was listed.
So Kidd is out there hunting these bad guys who are now causing an economic international crisis. But how did he become a bad guy all of a sudden?
Well, it's a long story and complicated, but I'm going to do it quickly. First thing was Commodore Thomas Warren had a fleet, an English fleet and East India Company fleet, and was sailing to the Indian Ocean. He came across Kidd and wanted to impress, which is just stealing, 40 of his seamen. And Kidd said, okay, I agree to it. Well, Kidd was just playing him. He didn't want his crew taken. He had a commission from the King of England, which was his role was as important as Commodore Thomas Warren, who got lost on the way down and didn't even Captain Kidd didn't get lost sailing to the Indian Ocean, but the Royal Navy Commodore Thomas Warren did, and so and he lost all his crew to scurvy. Kidd hadn't lost any of his crew to scurvy. Captain Kidd, that's how good a seaman he was. Well, so but old wrong way Warren, who couldn't find the continent of Africa, bumbling about the South Atlantic, had to steal Kidd's crew. Well, Kidd didn't want to steal his crew. He stood up for his crew and stole away in the night. And from that point on, he was labeled as a pirate or questionable. And so it just started with that. And then he did take ships in the Indian Ocean later, and he did stop a lot of ships and search them and then let them go. So there were a number of those going on, and some of those kind of got exaggerated reports and stuff. And he took two ships, but he took them legally with his commission. But the Great Mughal, they were connected to the Great Mughal of India, who at that point was just going ballistic and shutting down trade. And so Captain Kidd kind of paid the price, even though he was there to sit there to hunt pirates, for all the pirates who came before him, even though his captures were legal.
So he was kind of a scapegoat then.
He was definitely a scapegoat. And everyone agrees on that. That's where the Kidd story, everyone commits that, the Crown are not the good guys in the whole affair, making Captain Kidd to be the most villainous cutthroat of all time.
Yeah, and I know he gets involved with an argument with one of his crew, and he gets into more trouble there with hitting him in the head with a bucket. And
Yeah, and that's true. So what happened first of all, his crew, because they were desperate for the Red Sea $100 million payoff, they were trying to commit piracy the whole time. His gunner, William Moore, his chief gunner, who had 2 prison sentences to his name, was constantly trying to, we're going to take ships when Captain Kidd was trying to stop him. So he, for basically 9 months, was, of the voyage, or the first year of his voyage, is constantly trying to stop his crew from taking. He had stopped a Portuguese ship. Crew wanted to take it as a prize, take it, as commit piracy. He took a number of other ships too. He let them all go until he took 2 legal captures that presented French papers. So he finally, at some point, his gunners and him got in a heated argument. He picked up an empty wooden bucket and struck him a blow that killed the guy. So it was a spur of the moment, at worst manslaughter or no crime at all, because William Moore was committing mutiny, open mutiny at that point. So captains at that time, if you're committing mutiny and you kill a crew member, you would never go to prison for that. You would be dismissed, case would be dismissed 99.99% of the time. So Captain Kidd really either at worst committed manslaughter or committed no crime at all. And that's the worst that can be said. Certainly not premeditated murder with wooden bucket.
yeah, exactly. I'm planning on having this wooden bucket right next to me when I get into a fight with this guy. So yeah, you had the wooden bucket incident. You had the questionable stops. You had the impressment issue where he refused to have his men taken by the Royal Navy. So you had those things going on. So it starts to turn really bad for Kidd. But this is all laid out in a brilliant story. I don't want to spoil anything. I'm just saying is that his reputation goes from war hero now to a scapegoat for, in effect, the people who want to use him as a scapegoat, if I'm correct me if I'm wrong, are also the ones who sought to benefit from his journey there to hunt the pirates in the first place, weren't they?
Yes. So the group of investors who backed William Kidd's voyage, 1696 to 1699 voyage to the Indian Ocean, included the King of England, who was a silent partner who got a 10% cut. Like I said, the Duke of Shrewsbury, who was the Secretary of State, Admiral Russell, who was the head of the Royal Navy, of the Admiralty, the leading guy, and he was called Lord Orford. He became a lord. And these other guys, the Earl of Romney, who was kind of the chief of ordnance and kind of a womanizer. Apparently, he had 30 children, illegitimate children all over the place. So these guys were, these British, English nobles at the time, because Britain didn't form until 1707. But it was, yeah. So these guys are the most powerful guys. They talked them into this voyage, and Lord Belmont, of course, who was part of the Whig junto. They're part of the Whig junto, which was kind of the Whig leadership in the ministry. And then, they had Benjamin Harrison, who was kind of he came in because all these guys didn't want to put up money. They were kind of cheapskates. For being these nobles with all this money, they were sort of cheap, too, which is even worse. So Kidd got roped into it, didn't want to do it. And at the end of the day, they wanted to profit. But once he became persona non grata, they didn't want to have anything to do with him. So they all tried. Remember, their names were not revealed. They made their squires and coachmen sign the document. They didn't want to be on it because they knew it could go south early on. And that's why the king didn't want to be, he wanted it to be private investors group that did it, but he got his 10% cut as a silent partner. So all the royal officials were pretty scummy, that were trying to take advantage of Captain Kidd basically and exploiting him. So it is true that the leading nobles backed Captain Kidd's venture and dove for cover as soon as he got in the slightest bit of trouble.
Well, trouble he did get. And of course, the story takes us to Kidd returning back to New York and then to Boston and eventually to London, where he's tried. And without going further into what happens, it doesn't end well for him, shall we say.
Yeah, well, especially when you have to, I mean, we can talk about a couple things just because it's interesting. I won't get into the details of it, but the English crown hid his evidence, took it and misplaced it deliberately. We won't say who did that and how it was done, but that's a crime. They locked him up. First of all, he was incarcerated for 2 years, eating bread and water mostly, and just under horrendous conditions that would be unfathomable to us today. So Guantanamo Bay would be a country club compared to what Captain Kidd went through. I mean, in terms of the food deprivation alone. And so he was not given any money to defend himself. They withheld all of it. His lawyers couldn't meet with him. He wasn't allowed to meet with anybody. And then during his trial, his lawyers mysteriously disappeared under orders from the crown. We don't know. So without giving, and then what does Captain Kidd have to do? He has to defend himself as his own lawyer because lawyers back then couldn't defend you. They could only offer advice during the course on a legal issue. So you could lean to your lawyer and say, what does he mean? What is the judge, what does the judge mean here? Or something like that, or a question of protocol. But he had to cross-examine his own witnesses. And they couldn't testify, even if they, like his cabin boy, Richard Barleycorn, couldn't testify if he was accused of the same crime as Kidd. So a lot of his guys couldn't even testify to all the things that Captain Kidd did to avoid piracy. So, I mean, talk about a trial that's stacked. I mean, it's not even close. To his credit, he did a hell of a job for not being a lawyer at all.
He couldn't win, really, could he?
Not really. The crown was set. They couldn't catch Henry Avery, so they had to get Captain Kidd.
I tried to look up Henry Avery, and it said that it had his birth year, but then it said he disappeared.
Yeah, they never found him. They don't know what happened to him. Yet his spelling spelled Avery with an E and also with an A, so it's all over the place. But he was an English pirate. In 1695, or maybe even 94, he led a mutiny of a ship where the captains were treating him really badly, and the ship's owners were withholding their pay in La Corona, Spain. So he was kind of a good guy who led a mutiny, but then when he went to the Indian Ocean, I mean, raping and pillaging, and he was responsible for raping women, and he wrote it down too. And so he's not a hero. He made out to be a hero too. The funny thing is England celebrated him as Henry Avery and wrote all these stories of the noble Henry Avery. He was no Captain Kidd. Captain Kidd's much more of a hero than Henry Avery, at the end of the day,
And Kidd took the punishment that was due Avery
by far. Yes.
by far. So when Kidd, meets his sad end, his wife Sarah is notified. What happens to Sarah and her two children after she finds out that her husband has, in effect, paid the ultimate price?
Well, she finds out at least 2 months later, the crown officials show up at her beautiful Manhattan home right overlooking the East River at 119, 121 Pearl Street. And it was an incredible house. I mean, Captain Kidd had one of the best houses. It was a double wide house that he owned. They owned all this stuff legally. It had nothing to do with any Indian Ocean piracy. Well, they stormed into her house and said, you're tainted as a pirate. Your husband has been hung for piracy, and now you're attainted. That's what you were. You were attainted as the spouse of a pirate. So they took everything from her, and took her 2 years to hire a lawyer and get everything back. So they booted her out of her house, and it was taken by kind of a snooty crown official who had just moved over to become like one of he took Houghton, I think his name was, and he says, well, the real estate's so expensive here. Can I just have one of Captain Kidd's houses? Just give it to me. And when you read it, you cringe. And so, unfortunately, with all my cutbacks, that's one of the things I took. I think that's out now, but it was in the original. So, in any case, what a hard life because she's She spent all this time trying. Remember, she's a hero. She's trying to get kid out of prison. She's trying to negotiate with the Lord Belmont. She's doing all this stuff to help him when he's incarcerated in Boston. And then she comes home, and then she's booted out of her house. Her girls are on the street. Who knows where she went? Now, she was able to keep her pew. Remember, Captain Kidd helped build Trinity Church.
Oh, that's right.
He loaned the runner and tackle. She was allowed to keep her pew, Captain Kidd's pew, that said Captain Kidd commanded Adventure Galley. So she'd get to keep that for the rest of her life. So the church probably helped her a little bit, but she didn't have any money. They took everything, So and then she didn't remarry for 2 years, and then he helped her recover her money. That guy, she married a good guy. He was a good guy who helped her out, and then she ended up having 3 more children, and she lived a long life, and she learned to read and write. Because remember, she could only read, but she couldn't write. Back then, they didn't go hand in hand, which seems weird to me, but it was unusual that you could read a little bit, but you weren't taught to write. You had to be taught to write by usually your father. Some mothers did it too, though. So it was a weird time. So she learned to read and write, signed her own will and stuff at the end, and she lived a long life too. And she died a reasonably wealthy woman at made it to almost 70, I think. So
Wow.
she's an interesting story in her own right.
Yeah, a future book, if you have enough information out there to write even if it's a smaller book, it'd be a great one.
To give credit to Professor or PhD Daphne Giannakopoulos has written the definitive biography on Sarah Kidd. So I can give her a little shout out because she was a good reference for me and was kind enough to give me her PhD dissertation.
Now, do I understand or did I read that Sarah, is she buried in Trinity Cemetery in New York?
Yeah, she is. She's buried in Trinity Church Cemetery. I mean, unless it's been reconfigured in recent years, which I don't think so. So yeah, she's buried there, which is fitting for Kidd, because I mean, the thing about Captain Kidd that's fitting is he's everywhere today. I go to a Captain Kidd's restaurant out in California in Hermosa Beach. It's Captain Kidd's. He's at Woods Hole. There's a Captain Kidd's. He's everywhere. There's Captain Kidd Lanes. There's Captain Kidd the Rock Band. There's Captain Kidd Hotels. There's Captain Kidd pubs. In Wapping, there's a Captain Kidd pub. Of course, they have a little noose out there on the deck.
Oh,
Well, I mean, it's
ouch.
macabre, but but they celebrate him too.
Yeah.
So they celebrate Captain Kidd. They better get an order. They better get my book out there. Get a copy of that book beneath the noose.
Oh, wow. My wife Kelly and we got a gift certificate to Fraunce's Tavern in Manhattan. And I don't know if you've ever been there, but it is a Revolutionary War era a Revolutionary War era restaurant that I don't remember exactly when it was founded, but it's a great restaurant. It's down by the Pearl Street area, which is where your ancestors lived. And we're
Right.
going to be going there soon. So I want to kind of walk around that area and just picture what it was like when, Captain Kidd was walking up toward his front door after coming back from some long sea venture. And of course, maybe we could get into Trinity and see if there's where we can find Sarah's grave, in which case I would take a picture of it and send it to you.
That would be awesome.
Just a couple final words of some of the things I thought about when I was reading about Captain Kidd. The outside forces, in many ways, were outside of his immediate control. Certainly, the scheming royal officials, or Teflon officials, shall we say? But also he was dealing with a bunch of crews of not just one single ship. So there were multiple ships,
Yeah.
and if they weren't getting their pay, they weren't getting their booty, so to speak, that they were going to be unhappy. And how can one person on one ship be fully responsible or be able to affect some sort of redirection on the other ships? And all these people have been at sea. These men are just like, hey, we're out here. We want something back in return. You know what I mean? So
Yeah.
he was helpless in some ways, but still had to be responsible in other ways. And that's a tight place that I think even in business, you can be, where how much of it was under your direct control, but how much of it are you ultimately responsible for? And he was held ultimately responsible for his crews, in many cases, mutinous crews, actions. So there was so much at work, the government, the crews, the political environment, the economic environment, and everything in between. So I found him very sympathetic, but yeah, if you could talk to him and find out that one ship that's sort of iffy and sort of illegal, how much did you really, give your blessing to that, and how much of it was sort of
The
out of your
Portuguese galleot, yes, and that's the one. That's why I don't say that he wasn't. He wasn't a pirate, but he might have looked the other way towards piracy with the Portuguese galleot. It's the only definitive because the East India Company describe it and his crew describes it, not the unreliable narrators. See, you can't, the good kid scholars who know what they're talking about always recognize that Bradingham and Palmer got a royal pardon and are, they're like mob the mob informants tell the truth, but they also don't. They're not reliable by any stretch of the imagination on every detail. And I shouldn't be comparing Captain Kidd to the mob at all, but what I'm trying to say is that these informants, they were unreliable because they gave depositions in America that were directly contradicted later when they went to London. So they lied. We know they lied because we caught them. So Captain Kidd was under enormous. The amazing thing about Captain Kidd is he was such a charismatic figure and strong that he kept these guys together way longer than anybody else would have. They would, any other captain, they would have thrown him overboard to the sharks early on. But he kind of kept them together because he was, he knew what he was doing. He was a good navigator. And he was a good, captain. And he was a little tough, but he had to keep, these crew was very rebellious. They wanted Red Sea $150 million gold rush. And he was like, no, we're only taking pirate ships once they've captured the loot. We have to take the pirate ships or French ships. That's why now he finally did get those prize ships and got, he didn't get the $200 million payout, but it was more like 60, maybe even more, 60 to $100 million payout, is what he got, but by then the crew wanted to just go commit more piracy. They wanted to go back to the Red Sea and do it again. And he was like, no, we're going to go take he wanted to go take the pirate Robert Culliford, who was his old gunner who had mutinied and stolen his ship.
Oh boy.
So he was like, let's go get him. And they're all like, no, we're not going to do it. They didn't want to go risk injury. So they all became pirates. They became bona fide pirates on Madagascar, St. Mary's Island. So Kidd, he tried really hard not to be a pirate, to try and follow his commission, because I call him the Buccaneer Boy Scout, because he really was trying to, much more than any other alleged pirate. I say pirate in quotes. He tried so hard not to be a pirate. He didn't even want to go on the voyage. Come on.
I think after reading this book, if I could transport myself back in time regarding Captain Kidd, I would find that time where he was going through his little middle-age crisis there and say, hey, I think you got something really good going on here in New York. I think you should stay here. Leave well enough alone. But I just want to say thank you, Samuel. It's a wonderful book, Captain Kidd, A True Story of Treasure and Betrayal. I advise people to order it. The book's out there, so please get that book. There's so much rich narrative in here. It's just so fascinating. And again, I felt like I was on the high seas going on the adventure with Captain Kidd. Good stuff, Samuel. Again, thank you so much for being on our show, and we'll look forward to staying in touch. Maybe we can have you back.
That'd be great. I appreciate it. Thank you so much, James.
All right, Samuel, take care. Have a good day.
You too. Bye.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Your History, Your Story. Don't forget to follow us on YouTube, Facebook, X, and Instagram to stay connected. We'd love to hear from you, whether you have questions, comments, or a story to share. Until next time, be well and God bless.